Welcome to our channel. Before we get started, please consider liking and subscribing so we can bring more stories like this to you. I moved into my new home in a 55-plus community nearly 6 months ago, right after I retired. I've never lived in a neighborhood with a formal HOA before, so I was a bit apprehensive about the rules. Still, the manicured lawns, the clean sidewalks, and the quiet streets felt appealing, like a peaceful place to settle down. I quickly learned there was nothing peaceful about living under our particular HOA board, run by a woman named Linda. Picture a tall, sharp-tongued woman in her late 50s, with a perpetual scowl. Residents sometimes joked that she could spot a blade of grass out of alignment from half a block away. But what really cemented Linda's reputation as our local Karen wasn't her attention to detail, it was her relentless pursuit of power and control. Soon after moving in, I started meeting my neighbors. It's mostly retirees, some living alone, some with spouses, and a few with adult children who visit often. That's how I met Henry, a soft-spoken veteran in his early 70s. Despite being quite tall, he must have been over 6 feet at some point. He moved with a slight stoop, the result of an old back injury from his service days. He wore small hearing aids in both ears, and although they helped, he explained that his hearing loss was severe enough that he still missed doorbells, alarms, and other higher-pitched sounds. Not long after I introduced myself, Henry asked if I could help him carry groceries into his house. As we approached his front door, I couldn't help but notice a small, mounted device that looked like a strobe light. It wasn't obnoxious, just a small rectangular box. When I asked about it, Henry said with a grin, "That's my lifeline right there. It's a flashing alert for my doorbell and smoke alarm. If either goes off, the light flashes." Apparently, he had rigged it so that he'd never miss a visitor at the door or an emergency alert. I thought it was ingenious, simple, unobtrusive, and it gave Henry peace of mind. But about a week later, I saw Linda standing on the sidewalk, hands on her hips, glaring at Henry's house as if it had committed a personal offense. When she spotted me, she marched over and demanded, "You know about that strobe, right? It's an unauthorized exterior modification." I told her I'd seen it and that it was for Henry's hearing impairment. Her face remained as rigid as a stone statue. "We have rules," she snapped. "He never submitted a request for architectural approval. That contraption violates aesthetic guidelines." I tried to reason with her. "It's really not an eyesore, Linda. Plus, he needs it for his disability." She just brushed off my comment. "We have a procedure for these things. Everyone must abide by it." And that was the end of that conversation. She strode off, clipboard under her arm, looking for more infractions. The following week, Henry found a yellow citation notice taped to his front door. The notice claimed he had installed an unapproved device visible from the street and demanded its removal within 7 days or face fines. He was baffled. After all, in his mind, it wasn't some big construction project, it was a safety measure. He had even put in tinted covers so the strobe wouldn't bother neighbors at night. But apparently, that wasn't enough. I ran into Henry at the community mail kiosk, where he showed me the citation. He looked genuinely distressed. "I don't know how to fight this," he said quietly. "I've never had a problem like this before. I need that alarm to stay safe." He tried calling Linda. That didn't help. Then he attended one of the monthly HOA open board meetings, where he was essentially ignored. Linda barely let him speak and brushed aside his concerns with a dismissive wave of her hand. Other board members mostly stayed silent, either cowed by Linda or uninterested in siding with Henry. To them, it seemed like a minor issue about some unattractive device, as Linda put it. I felt my blood boiling. Part of the problem was how Linda twisted the narrative. She claimed Henry's strobe light was blinding at night, even though Henry insisted it only flashed if someone rang the doorbell or if the smoke alarm went off. The chances of it going off randomly in the middle of the night were practically zero. Still, Linda pressed the matter. She made it sound like the second someone walked by Henry's house, they'd be dazzled by some obnoxious light show. Despite his anxiety, Henry filed a formal request for a disability accommodation, complete with a doctor's note explaining his hearing impairment. He also attached copies of the product specifications to show how minimal the light output was. A part of me felt relieved, surely the board would approve it, given the circumstances. But just days later, another notice arrived in Henry's mailbox, request denied. The official reason? A failure to maintain architectural harmony. I couldn't believe it. Here was an elderly man just trying to live safely, and the board, under Linda's lead, was shutting him down like he'd tried to build a neon billboard on his front lawn. That was when I realized we were dealing with something bigger than just a clash over a device. Linda wanted to set an example, to show she had full authority, and Henry was her unfortunate target. Even though everything else about Henry's property was immaculate, his lawn was always trimmed, and his house matched the required paint palette, Linda had zeroed in on him because he'd done something without her permission. I spoke to Henry again. He was holding up, but I could see the stress. I might have to take it down, he sighed, but it feels wrong to give in. This is about my safety. I could practically see him wrestling with fear of harassment, fear of lawsuits, fear of losing his home. Still, Henry wasn't a man easily cowed. He decided to see if there was a legal route for him to fight the denial, even though the prospect of a long, drawn-out process worried him immensely. I wished I could do more to help. I told him I'd support him in any way possible, even if that meant speaking out at HOA meetings or telling other neighbors about his situation. As I walked back to my home that evening, I couldn't shake an uneasy feeling. Something told me Linda wasn't done yet. And if Henry kept resisting, I suspected this fight was going to escalate far beyond a simple fine. Little did I know just how right I was. Over the next few days, things went from tense to outright hostile. Henry had decided not to remove his strobe device. He told me, "I'll pay the fine if I have to. I'm not going to risk missing an alarm in the middle of the night." When the board sent him a second citation, this time with an even larger fine, he wrote a heartfelt letter to each board member. He explained, yet again, that his hearing impairment wasn't something to take lightly, and that removing the device could put him at serious risk. Linda's response? Another official-looking letter dropped into Henry's mailbox, this time threatening legal action if he didn't comply with the removal order. They quoted some clause in the covenants about unapproved external additions. It read like a doomsday scenario. The HOA could place a lien on his house or even move forward with foreclosure if he refused to pay repeated fines. I thought it was overkill. After all, it was just a small strobe alert, not an illegally built structure. But Linda seemed determined to make him an example. Frustrated and a bit desperate, Henry tried to schedule a private meeting with Linda to talk it out. She refused to meet him one-on-one, insisting all discussions go through the official violation resolution process. So Henry did the next best thing. He showed up to the community center for the monthly public HOA meeting, determined to speak his piece in front of everyone. I decided to go too, just to lend my support. I wasn't sure how many other residents knew the details, so I reached out to a few neighbors. Most were sympathetic. Many said that if they had a disability, they'd hoped the HOA would work with them. A handful of people, however, shrugged it off, saying Linda was a stickler and that Henry should have just asked for permission beforehand. It was amazing how quickly people took sides. The meeting itself was surreal. We were in a big, fluorescent-lit room with folding chairs arranged in rows. Linda sat at a long table at the front, flanked by 4 other board members. Henry waited patiently while they droned through agenda items like lawn maintenance guidelines and speed limit reminders. Finally, Linda called for open forum, which was the official time for residents to speak. Henry stood up, cleared his throat, and began telling his story. He was calm and methodical, explaining his hearing impairment and how the device worked. He had copies of his doctor's letter and photos showing how discreet the strobe was. Then he asked simply, "Why can't an exception be made for a medical necessity? I'm willing to work with you on any aesthetic concerns." Linda hardly let him finish. With a curt gesture, she stated, "We can't allow any resident to violate our agreements. If you needed this device, you should have followed protocol before installing it. That's all there is to it." Linda's voice carried an edge. "Ignorance of the rules doesn't grant exemption from them, Mr. Saunders." She glanced at the other board members, who nodded in half-hearted agreement. The tension in the room was palpable. Another neighbor chimed in, "He's asking for a disability accommodation. Aren't we legally required to consider that?" Someone else added, "We should be helping Henry, not penalizing him." Suddenly, Linda snapped, "One more outburst and this meeting ends immediately." Her eyes darted angrily around the room. I realized she was losing control of the narrative she'd so carefully curated. People were siding with Henry. But Linda had a trump card. She told Henry he was in violation of the rules and had disregarded repeated citations. Then she dropped a bombshell. At this point, non-compliance might be considered trespassing on HOA property standards, which can be enforced by local authorities. "We'll do whatever it takes to maintain the integrity of our community." Those words sent a ripple through the crowd. Trespassing on HOA property standards? That sounded absurd. Even Henry looked taken aback, unsure what it even meant. Before he could respond, Linda banged the gavel. Meeting adjourned. Over the next few days, rumors flew around that Linda had actually called the police on Henry to file a complaint about his unauthorized device. I thought it was just idle gossip. Then, one late afternoon, I saw flashing red and blue lights outside Henry's house. 2 police cruisers were parked along the curb, and Linda was standing on the sidewalk, arms crossed over her chest. I hurried over. Henry was on his porch, looking confused but trying to stay polite. One officer was explaining they'd received a complaint about a possible code violation that could involve electrical hazards or neighborhood disturbances. The officer seemed apologetic, as if he realized how frivolous the call was. Linda insisted, "That thing is dangerous. It flashes at night and could cause accidents or health issues for neighbors with sensitivity to lights." I couldn't believe my ears. Linda was spinning a brand new narrative, that Henry's strobe light was a potential epilepsy trigger or a hazard to passing drivers. She seemed determined to throw every possible angle at him. Henry calmly explained it was only connected to his doorbell and smoke alarm, and that in the months since he installed it, not a single neighbor had complained directly to him. The officers took notes, looked at the device, and concluded there was no immediate threat or violation. One officer mentioned that in civil disputes like this, they don't typically intervene beyond ensuring there's no criminal activity. Linda's face was red with frustration, but she put on a show of concern for the community. After the officers left, Henry shook his head at me. "I'm getting real tired of this," he muttered. "I never wanted to make a fuss, but Linda's turning it into a war." Word about the police visit spread fast. Some neighbors were outraged on Henry's behalf, but others started whispering that maybe Linda had a point. What if the strobe was more dangerous than Henry let on? Seeds of doubt were planted. It felt like Linda had scored a small victory in her campaign to discredit him. I tried reassuring Henry. "Don't let her bully you," I said. "She's exaggerating. Anyone can see it's harmless." But Henry looked exhausted. He started hinting that maybe he should just remove the device, pay the fines, and end the whole ordeal. The stress wasn't good for his blood pressure, he said. He had a doctor's appointment coming up, and it was the last thing he needed. Still, Henry decided to hang on just a little longer. "I might talk to a lawyer," he told me. "Maybe someone who understands HOAs and disability laws. I'd hate to leave this place. My mortgage is almost paid off, and I like the neighbors. But I'm not sure how much longer I can fight." It was painful to watch. Linda, with her endless citations and threats, seemed hell-bent on breaking Henry's resolve. And if he gave in, it wouldn't stop there. What if another resident had a legitimate medical concern in the future? Linda's iron-fisted style would only grow stronger. I knew Henry wasn't just fighting for himself, he was fighting for the principle that our community needed a heart, not just rules. Despite his frazzled nerves, Henry decided on one final stand. He found a local advocacy group that helps seniors navigate housing disputes. And that was the tipping point. Because once Linda realized Henry wasn't going to roll over, especially not with legal help on his side, things escalated faster than I ever imagined, culminating in a showdown that would put the entire area under the microscope. 2 weeks after the police visit, Henry received a court summons. The HOA had filed a lawsuit demanding removal of the device in violation of community covenants and payment of accrued fines. They alleged that Henry had knowingly and flagrantly broken the rules, resulting in what they termed irreparable harm to property values. The language was so hyperbolic it almost seemed laughable, yet it was terrifying in its seriousness. If Henry lost, he could be on the hook for massive legal fees, and the HOA would have carte blanche to enforce their rules however they wanted. Henry's initial shock turned into quiet determination. He reached out to that senior advocacy group, which put him in touch with an attorney who specialized in fair housing issues. The lawyer immediately saw potential for a counterclaim, arguing that the HOA had violated Henry's rights by refusing a reasonable disability accommodation. There was even a possibility the HOA had run afoul of the Americans with Disabilities Act or parallel state laws. For the first time since this ordeal began, Henry looked hopeful. "At least I have someone in my corner who knows what they are doing," he told me. Meanwhile, Linda seemed convinced she'd sail through the lawsuit without so much as a scratch. Rumor was, she boasted to a few neighbors that the HOA's attorney was top-notch, and that Henry's claim of discrimination wouldn't stand a chance. When the date for the initial hearing arrived, about a dozen residents, myself included, showed up at the courthouse to show our support for Henry. Linda and 2 board members walked in with their lawyer, wearing matching scowls. Henry was there with his attorney and a representative from the senior advocacy group. It felt strange seeing our quiet neighbor so wrapped up in a legal battle, but here we were. The hearing was brief, mainly to set schedules and clarify the claims. Henry's attorney argued that the HOA had refused to accommodate a well-documented disability without any legitimate reason. He also noted that Henry's attempts at resolution, submitting medical documentation, asking for a variance, were all summarily denied. Linda's lawyer doubled down, painting Henry as someone who deliberately broke the rules and ignored the formal process. The judge didn't look convinced that a small flashing device warranted the dramatic language the HOA was using. I caught Linda shooting daggers at the judge, as if she sensed the tide might not be in her favor. A few weeks later came the next big step, a settlement conference. This was supposed to be a chance to negotiate, but Henry's attorney told us afterward that Linda had refused any compromise. She demanded full removal of the device, full payment of fines, and Henry's formal admission that he violated the rules. Henry wouldn't budge. After months of stress, he was ready to see this through to trial if necessary. "I've come this far," he said. "I'm not giving up my home or my dignity over a strobe light that helps me here." In a twist that I'll never forget, just days before the trial was set to begin, Linda was involved in her own minor legal scrape. Apparently, she had verbally harassed a different neighbor, an elderly woman who was planting some new shrubs. That neighbor filed a harassment complaint with local authorities. It got overshadowed by Henry's case in the community gossip circuit, but it certainly didn't do Linda any favors in terms of public perception. Suddenly, several more residents stepped forward, sharing stories of how Linda had threatened or bullied them over trivial matters. It was like the community had collectively decided enough was enough. By the time Henry's court date arrived, the atmosphere had shifted dramatically. The HOA board was in damage control mode. Linda's iron grip seemed to be slipping. When we got to the courthouse, a mediator approached Henry's attorney with a last-ditch settlement offer. The HOA would waive all fines, allow the device to remain if Henry agreed to paint the small mounting bracket to match the house's trim, and put an end to the lawsuit. At first, it sounded like a victory. But there was a catch. Linda wanted Henry to sign a non-disclosure agreement preventing him from speaking about the dispute. Henry looked uneasy. He asked his attorney and the advocacy group for advice. They pointed out that an NDA would let Linda and the HOA bury the incident, which might enable them to pull the same stunt on someone else later. Henry made his decision almost instantly. "No. I want this addressed out in the open," he said firmly. If it meant going to trial, so be it. The HOA must have sensed they had no chance if the details came out in public testimony. Less than 24 hours after Henry rejected the NDA, the HOA's lawyer officially withdrew the lawsuit. They also released a statement allowing Henry's device under a special accommodation clause. It was the biggest about-face I'd ever seen. Linda's name was conspicuously absent from the statement. A week later, the board announced that Linda was resigning due to personal reasons. Whispers floated around that it wasn't exactly voluntary, that the board members pressured her to step down for the good of the community. Plenty of residents were fed up with her brand of intimidation, and Henry's case had become a rallying cry for change. In the aftermath, a couple of more moderate neighbors took over the board's leadership. They promised to review and revise the HOA guidelines to ensure compliance with disability laws and basic human decency. Henry, for his part, was relieved the ordeal was over. He no longer had to worry about losing his home, racking up fines, or being dragged through court. It took him a while to let his guard down. Months of hostility don't just vanish overnight, but he told me that he finally felt he could breathe again. Standing on his porch one early morning, I noticed the faint glimmer of that little strobe device. It remained right where it belonged, ready to flash for the doorbell or an emergency alarm. Henry caught my eye and smiled, his posture a little straighter than before. It wasn't just about the device, it was about the principle that we could live in a community that respects each other's needs, not just a rulebook. In the end, Linda's attempt at making an example out of Henry backfired in the best possible way. The community realized the HOA should serve its residents, not terrorize them. Henry kept his home, his safety, and his dignity. And as far as I'm concerned, the next time someone calls Henry a troublemaker, I'll be the first to say that sometimes, a little trouble is exactly what an unjust system needs.